Patricia Garrison had both hands wrapped around my prize-winning grape clusters when I caught her red-handed in my vineyard that September morning. She stood there frozen with her pruning shears still open, wearing her HOA president badge like it gave her diplomatic immunity. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in my living room, face pale as parchment paper, after discovering she had not just trespassed on private property, but had attempted to steal from the man who owns 75% of Maplewood Valley. My name is David Hartley, and I have always been the type who prefers staying under the radar. I work remotely as a software architect, maintain my property to neighborhood standards, and spend my free time cultivating the small vineyard that borders the eastern edge of Riverside Estates. The neighborhood itself looks like something from a magazine with its manicured lawns, decorative street lamps, and uniform mailboxes. Unfortunately, it also comes with an HOA that treats every blade of grass like a matter of national security. Patricia Garrison had been HOA president for 3 years, and she wore that title like a crown. At 52 years old, with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses permanently perched on her head, she patrolled our streets in her white Lexus SUV looking for violations. She once fined the Johnsons $75 because their garden gnome was 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. She made old Mr. Peterson repaint his shutters 3 times because the shade of blue was not on the approved color list. My problems with Patricia started innocently enough. Last spring, she left a notice on my door stating that my grapevines were in violation of Section 12.4 of the HOA guidelines regarding uniform horticultural aesthetics. According to her interpretation, fruit-bearing plants were not permitted in areas visible from the street. I responded with a polite email explaining that my vineyard predated the HOA by 15 years and was grandfathered in under the original neighborhood covenants. That should have been the end of it, but Patricia had other ideas. At the next HOA meeting, she proposed that since my grapes were visible to the community, they should be considered a shared resource. She actually stood at that podium and suggested with a straight face that my personal vineyard should provide free grapes for HOA events and fundraisers. When I objected, she smiled that condescending smile of hers and said the board would discuss it further. 2 weeks later, I found her leading a group of potential home buyers through my vineyard without permission. She was gesturing at my vines and explaining how the HOA maintained this beautiful community asset for all residents to enjoy. When I confronted her, she brushed me off saying she was simply showcasing the neighborhood amenities. I installed no trespassing signs the next day. Patricia responded by sending me a violation notice for the signs, claiming they were not approved signage under HOA guidelines. Then she filed a complaint with the city saying my vineyard was attracting wildlife that could be dangerous to children. When the city inspector came out and found nothing wrong, she tried a different approach. She started telling neighbors that I was selfish for not sharing my harvest with the community. The situation escalated when she began hosting unauthorized tours of what she called the community vineyard. I would come home from grocery shopping to find strangers wandering between my vines, taking photos, and sometimes helping themselves to grapes. Each time I asked them to leave, they would look confused and say Patricia had given them permission. I started keeping a log of these incidents and installed security cameras. Then came that fateful September morning. I was working from home when I noticed movement in the vineyard through my office window. There was Patricia with a large wicker basket using professional-grade pruning shears to cut entire clusters of my best Pinot Noir grapes. She was not even trying to be subtle about it. She had parked her Lexus right at the edge of my property with the trunk open and several boxes already loaded. I walked out calmly, my phone recording video. She looked up as I approached but did not stop cutting. In fact, she smiled at me like we were old friends and said, "Good morning, David." Just collecting grapes for the HOA Harvest Festival wine auction. The casual way she said it, like she had every right to be there, made my blood pressure spike. I kept my voice level as I said, "Patricia, you are trespassing on private property and stealing my grapes. Please put down the shears and leave immediately." She actually laughed. That tinkling fake laugh she used at board meetings. She said, "David, really now? We have been over this. The HOA has determined that this vineyard is a community asset. Besides, technically this entire hillside is HOA common area. You just happen to live adjacent to it." That is when I smiled. The first genuine smile I had given Patricia in months. I said, "Patricia, would you mind coming inside for a moment? I have some documents I think you should see." She rolled her eyes but followed me, probably thinking I was going to show her my property deed again. She left her basket of stolen grapes on my porch like she planned to come back for them. I led her to my home office where I had a filing cabinet dedicated to property records, not just for my house, but for the entire valley. I pulled out a thick folder and spread the papers across my desk. Patricia stood there with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. Then I began explaining what she was looking at. These documents showed that over the past 20 years, my family had quietly purchased parcels of land throughout Maplewood Valley. It started with my grandfather who bought the original Vineyard property. Then my father expanded, purchasing adjoining lots as they became available. When he passed away 5 years ago, I inherited everything. I had continued his strategy, buying land through various LLCs to avoid attracting attention. As Patricia studied the surveys and deeds, her expression began to change. The smug confidence drained from her face as she realized what she was looking at. I own not just my vineyard and house, but the entire hillside that Riverside Estates was built on. Every single home in the HOA, including hers, sat on land that I owned through 99-year lease agreements that the original developer had signed with my grandfather. Her voice came out as barely a whisper when she said, "This cannot be right. There must be some mistake." I pulled out another document, the master lease agreement that clearly stated the terms. The HOA and all residents were essentially my tenants. They owned their homes, but not the land underneath them. More importantly, all common areas that the HOA claimed to control were actually my property that I allowed them to use through the lease agreement. Patricia sank into the chair across from my desk, her face now completely white. I explained that I had never exercised my ownership rights because I preferred to live quietly and let the HOA handle the day-to-day maintenance of the common areas, but her recent actions had forced me to reconsider that arrangement. I pulled out my phone and showed her the video I had just recorded of her stealing my grapes. I said, "Patricia, you have not just trespassed on HOA common area. You have trespassed on my private property and committed theft. I have you on camera and I have documented every instance of you bringing unauthorized people onto my land. I could press criminal charges right now or we could handle this differently." She looked up at me with wide eyes and asked what I wanted. I leaned back in my chair and laid out my terms. First, she would immediately cease all claims that my vineyard was HOA property and send a written apology to all residents clarifying the matter. Second, she would pay me market rate for all the grapes she had already taken, which by my calculation came to $800. Third, she would resign as HOA president effective immediately. Patricia started to protest, but I held up my hand. I continued by saying if she refused, I would not only press criminal charges for theft and trespassing, but I would also invoke my rights as the actual landowner. I would start charging the HOA rent for use of all common areas, including the clubhouse, pool, and walking trails. The amount would be substantial enough to require a significant increase in HOA dues, and I would make sure every resident knew exactly why their fees had tripled. The color drained from her face even more if that was possible. She realized that not only would she face criminal charges, but she would also be remembered as the HOA president who caused everyone's dues to skyrocket. Her reputation in the neighborhood would be destroyed. She asked in a shaky voice if she paid the $800 and resigned. Would I keep quiet about owning the land? I told her that as long as the HOA respected my property rights and never bothered me about my vineyard again, I saw no reason to exercise my ownership rights. I would continue to let them use the common areas as they had been. But if anyone from the HOA ever trespassed on my vineyard again or tried to claim my grapes were community property, I would immediately start collecting rent. Patricia wrote me a check for $800 right there in my office, her hand shaking as she signed it. Then she asked if she could use my computer to type her resignation letter. I watched as she wrote a brief statement saying she was stepping down as HOA president for personal reasons. Effective immediately. She sent it to the entire HOA board and all residents through the community email list. Within an hour, my phone was ringing with confused neighbors asking what had happened. I simply told them that Patricia and I had resolved our differences regarding my vineyard and she had decided it was time for new leadership. By that evening, the vice president had called an emergency meeting to discuss the transition. Patricia did not attend. The next morning, I saw Patricia loading boxes into her Lexus. Word spread quickly that she was putting her house on the market. I heard from neighbors that she told people she had received a job offer in another state, but everyone suspected there was more to the story. The speed of her departure after 3 years of iron-fisted rule over the HOA was too sudden to be coincidental. At the next HOA meeting, the new interim president announced that after reviewing the neighborhood covenants and property records, it was clear that my vineyard was private property and not subject to HOA regulations. He apologized for any confusion and assured me that the HOA would respect my property rights going forward. Several neighbors approached me afterward to apologize for participating in Patricia's unauthorized tours. 3 months later, Patricia's house sold to a young couple with 2 kids. I saw the moving truck pull away with the last of her belongings on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She never returned to Riverside Estates, not even for the annual holiday party she had hosted for 3 years running. Her replacement as HOA president turned out to be far more reasonable, focusing on actual community issues rather than petty power trips. The $800 check Patricia wrote me cleared without issue. I donated the money to the local food bank in the name of Riverside Estates, HOA, making sure the donation was announced in the community newsletter. It seemed fitting that her stolen grape money would go to actually helping the community rather than funding her wine auction power play. A year later, I heard through the grapevine that Patricia had tried to become HOA president in her new neighborhood in another state. However, when they did a background check and called our HOA for a reference, they learned about her sudden resignation and decided to go with another candidate. Her reputation for overreach had followed her even across state lines. These days, my vineyard thrives in peace. The new HOA board even asked politely if I would be willing to sell them some grapes for their annual fundraiser. I agreed at market price, of course, and delivered them personally in boxes clearly labeled with my vineyard's name. No one has questioned my ownership since, and the no trespassing signs remain respected by all. The irony was not lost on me that Patricia's attempt to steal my grapes had backfired so spectacularly. She went from being the most powerful person in the neighborhood to fleeing in disgrace, all because she could not respect simple property rights. Her HOA presidency ended, her reputation ruined, and she faced $800 in restitution that she paid immediately to avoid criminal prosecution.